艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 8 Mrs. Elton. It was spring. The people of Highbury saw Mrs. Elton for the first time in the church. Emma was one of the first people to call on Mr. Elton's wife at the vicarage, and she took Harriet with her. Emma remembered the last time that she had been in the vicar's house. Harriet sat silently. Her face was pale. She remembered too. The visit was short, but Emma's first opinion of Mrs. Elton was not good. Mrs. Elton was wearing an elegant dress, but she herself was not elegant. She was vulgar. She was not very polite, and she talked too much. Mr. Elton was not happy to see Emma again, and he said very little. His manners were not those of a real gentleman. The Eltons soon came to call at Hartfield. Harriet was not visiting the house, so Mr. Woodhouse talked to Mr. Elton. Emma was able to watch Mrs. Elton carefully. Emma soon made up her mind about Mrs. Elton. She was a vain and silly woman who only thought of money and polite society. "Hartfield is very like my brother-in-law's house, Maple Grove," Mrs. Elton said, walking about. "This room is like the smallest sitting room at Maple Grove, and the staircase here is exactly the same. I have spent so many happy months at Maple Grove. I did not expect to find a house like Maple Grove in Highbury. I think that the garden here is much the same too, but smaller, of course. I feel very comfortable here at Hartfield, Miss Woodhouse, very comfortable." "I am pleased to hear that," Emma said. Mrs. Elton walked to the window and looked through it. "Yes, I was right," she said with a smile. "The garden here is like the garden at Maple Grove. I am sure that the country around Highbury is very fine too," Mrs. Elton went on. "Mr. Suckling, my brother-in-law, will be visiting us in the spring. He has a very large carriage and will drive us to the most beautiful places. I am sure that you and your friends enjoy driving around the neighbourhood too." "The people of Highbury are usually happy to stay at home," Emma said quietly. Mrs. Elton looked at Mr. Woodhouse and sighed. "I understand that your father's health keeps him at home," Mrs. Elton said sadly. "Why does he not go to Bath? I am sure that a visit to Bath would be good for him, and for you too, Miss Woodhouse. I could give you introductions to the very best people there." Emma was very angry, but she did not let Mrs. Elton see her feelings. She decided to talk about something else. "I believe that you are interested in music, Mrs. Elton," Emma said with a smile. "We enjoy good music in Highbury." "Oh, yes, I cannot live without music," Mrs. Elton replied. "But I am a married woman now, Miss Woodhouse. I may not have time for music." Emma had no answer to that, and soon Mrs. Elton began talking again. "Mr. Elton and I visited Randalls earlier," she said. "The Westons seem to be very pleasant people. Mrs. Weston was your governess, I believe. She has very good manners. But who do you think came in when we were there, Miss Woodhouse?" Emma did not know. "It was Knightley," Mrs. Elton said happily. "My husband's friend, Knightley. I like Knightley very much. He is a real gentleman. I shall invite him to dine at the vicarage." It was time for the Eltons to leave. Emma was delighted to see them go. "What a vulgar woman," Emma said to herself when she was alone. She thinks that Mr. Knightley is a gentleman. She calls him Knightley, not Mr. Knightley, but Knightley. And she thinks that dear Mrs. Weston has very good manners. Mr. Elton has chosen a very unsuitable wife. He has made a bad choice. I wonder what Frank Churchill would think about Mrs. Elton. He will certainly laugh at her. Then she thought for a second and smiled. I am always thinking about Frank Churchill. I must be a little in love with him. Emma did not change her opinion of Mrs. Elton, and Mrs. Elton no longer tried to please Emma Woodhouse. When they met again, Mrs. Elton had changed. She was very unfriendly. Mr. and Mrs. Elton were both unkind to Harriet, and that made Emma angry too. Mrs. Elton had decided that her best friend in Highbury would be Jane Fairfax. "What a delightful girl dear Jane is," Mrs. Elton said to Emma one day. "She is so charming, and she plays and sings so well. But the poor girl is too quiet. I shall introduce Jane to all my friends. I understand that she is going to be a governess," Mrs. Elton went on. "I must find the very best family for her. I know so many good families who need a governess, Miss Woodhouse. I shall soon find a good position somewhere for my poor dear Jane." Emma did not understand or like Jane, but she began to feel sorry for her. Jane Fairfax had now been in Highbury for 3 months. The Campbells and the Dixons had decided to stay in Ireland until the summer. They invited Jane to stay with them there, but she refused. One day Mrs. Weston visited Hartfield. Mr. Knightley was also there. "Why does Jane Fairfax stay in Highbury?" Emma asked Mrs. Weston. "She cannot enjoy going to the vicarage." "Perhaps it is better than always being with Mrs. and Miss Bates," Mrs. Weston replied. "You are right, Mrs. Weston," Mr. Knightley said. "If Jane had other friends, she might not have chosen Mrs. Elton." As he spoke, Mr. Knightley looked at Emma. "At least Mrs. Elton is kind to Jane Fairfax," he added. "We all know how much you admire Jane Fairfax," Emma said quickly. "Yes, I do admire her," Mr. Knightley said. "I admire Jane Fairfax very much." "Be careful that your admiration does not become something else," Emma said with a laugh. "I understand you," Mr. Knightley said. "But Miss Fairfax would not marry me if I asked her, and I am not going to ask her. Do not start matchmaking again, Emma. Remember what happened with Harriet Smith." "I am not matchmaking," Emma replied. "I do not want you to marry Jane Fairfax. I do not want you to marry anyone, Mr. Knightley." Mr. Knightley smiled. "Jane Fairfax is very charming, but she is not perfect," he said. "She keeps her thoughts to herself. I like people to say what they think. Jane is a woman of strong feelings, but she is very reserved. I admire her, but that is all." After Mr. Knightley had left, Mrs. Weston looked at Emma and laughed. "Mr. Knightley is very sure that he does not love Jane," Mrs. Weston said. "Perhaps he is too sure. We shall see."